Hey guys, welcome back. So today we want to talk about the Glock Generation 6. The Glock took the world by storm in the early 1980s. In 1982, it was adopted by the Austrian military and police. And the gun really kind of shook up the entire gun industry when it appeared in the US market in the early 1980s. 39 years later, after it was adopted by Austria, it's still being manufactured, and it looks not much different than this Generation 1 handgun I'm showing you right now. And this is an original Gen 1 Glock 17. So while Glock didn't really pioneer anything, striker-fired pistols weren't new, polymer frames weren't new, it didn't really pioneer anything, but it took all the different bits and pieces that were already out there on the market, put it into one design, and it became famously popular with law enforcement here in the United States, with militaries around the world, police around the world, and with civilian shooters and even competitive shooters. The Glock really shined for 40 years. But in those 40 years, we've gotten 5 different major generations of guns. Soon we'll have a Generation 6, and that's what this video is about. Guys, before we get started with today's video, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel. It really helps us out. A surprisingly small number of you guys that watch our videos actually subscribe to the channel. So click that subscribe button. It helps us out with the algorithms, and you can turn off notifications. It's not going to blow up your inbox. And also share the videos. That helps us out. And then comment down below. I look forward to reading your comments. And again, it helps us with the algorithms. Let's get started with today's video. Guys, please swing by and check out Big Daddy Unlimited, BDU. They help support us here at the Military Arms Channel with products and things like that so we can continue to bring you content. There's a link in the video description down below that'll take you to the Mac blog and website. Please follow that link, and from there you'll find a link to Big Daddy Unlimited, and try them out just for 99 cents. You can see what they're all about. In essence, they're just like a big online store that has amazing prices. So please, again, check out BDU. So laid out in front of me, I have 5 generations of Glock pistols, starting with the Generation 1 here, 2, 3, 4, and 5, and then the 19X, which is a little bit different than the Gen 5, but still in the Gen 5 family. Now, there are a bunch of sub-variations of these different guns out there, bigger, smaller, different calibers. We even have single-stack guns out there that are in 380 caliber and 9mm caliber. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about, with the main product line, the big generational changes that went on with the 17 and the 19 pistol, which would be carried over into the 40 Smith & Wesson and even 45 ACP pistols. But the full-size pistols, if you will. Glock 19 being a concealed carry type handgun, a little bit smaller. So the Generation 1 handgun started off with, pretty basic features. Magazine release, a slide stop, slide release only on the left-hand side of the pistol. No real texturing to speak of on the front and back straps. A very smooth texture to the grip in general. It has cuts front and rear for stripping out those magazines, either this way or this way, by pinching it that way. And then one of the signature features of a Generation 1 Glock would also be the non-captive recoil spring and guide rod. So this will change very quickly. But you guys are familiar with the internal safeties and things like that. The Glocks never have had manual safeties on them, and that would be true of all the generations up until present. All right, so then we get to the Generation 2 handgun. The Generation 2 handgun introduces aggressive texturing on the front and back, very similar texturing on the side. We don't have thumb scallops yet. Same magazine release, same slide stop slide release, not present on the right-hand side of the handgun. And the dust cover is still the same. You can see it kind of slightly turns up, which would drive some folks crazy. They would complain about it. The trigger guard will stay the same. The Glock has never been very good for gloved hands. This is a relatively thin glove. It's a mechanics. If you have a really protective winter glove on, you're not going to get your finger in the trigger guard without starting to push that trigger back. In any of the generations, that trigger guard has remained small, and that's one of the reasons I quit carrying the Glock 19. But again, texturing was the big deal, and go ahead and make the weapon safe. The introduction of the captive recoil spring, okay? The guns from the Generation 1 to the Generation 2 have polygonal rifling in the barrel. And that polygonal rifling would carry over to the Generation 3 handgun that we see here. Now, Glock would go on to mess around with different textures. This is one of the RTF textures on here, and they mess around with the slide serrations a little bit, and these were known as the fish gills, didn't last for very long. So Glock was trying different ergonomic things. We see the introduction of the thumb rest, if you will, in the pistol grip. It's just present on both sides, kind of a little flare there. And we see that that cut in the front has now gone, but it's still present in the rear on the magazine well. We have the introduction of the finger grooves. Now this is important because this would cause a bit of a civil war, if you will, in the Glock community, because so many people hated the finger grooves that the aftermarket community would find ways to, take them off the polymer frame and things like that. So that was a really big change for a lot of Glock people. They either loved it or they hated it. Then we also saw the introduction of the accessory rail on the Generation 3 handgun. So you can mount lights and things like that. We also saw the introduction of the 2-pin trigger system. So in the Gen 1 and the Gen 2, you'll see it has a single pinhole. The addition of a second pin was done to reinforce the locking block in the frame of the handgun, or so that's what I've read. And then you would also notice the recoil spring and guide rod would be very similar to the Generation 2. This is difficult to do with gloves on, believe it or not. There we go. Still have the same captive recoil spring. The Generation 3 remains in production, I believe, and I might be wrong on this because of the California market. The Generation 3 was approved for the California roster, and so Glock continued to make the Generation 3 for quite some time. So those are the big changes for the Generation 3. Generation 4 handgun, we see the adoption of one of the RTF type texturings. So this is a bit more aggressive than any of the previous generations that was played with the Generation 3. We see an enlarged magazine release, which is definitely reversible. The grip frame and the grip angle has not changed ever in the entire history of the 40-year history of the handgun. So this has always remained the same. We still don't have the cutout in the front, but we have the cutout back here. The finger grooves have been maintained. And then we see the introduction of the back strap here, so you can slide on or pop on different back straps to increase the width of the handgun, and even with a couple of them, increase the length of the beaver tail in the rear. The Generation 4 would see the introduction of the nested recoil springs that are captive. So that's a pretty big change from the previous 3 generations. Where did I put you? But even in the Generation 4 handgun, we don't see the inclusion of an ambi slide stop slide release. By this time, the competitive products on the market were offering fully ambi controls. Glock, kind of conceded to peer pressure and went to the back straps to increase the thickness, but I've never liked that feature. A lot of people love it, a lot of people hate it. So then we move over to the Generation 5 handgun. Now we have a 19-sized handgun here, but the features are basically the same as the 17-sized handguns that we've been looking at here. So maintained is the accessory rail. We see the introduction of forward slide serrations. We see the introduction of optics cut slides that can accept optics like the Acro on here from Aimpoint. And then we see the introduction of an ambi slide stop slide release, but still not an ambi magazine release. I mean, you have to reverse the magazine controls if you want left-handed use. It doesn't have truly ambi features in terms of the magazine release. Maintained back straps that you can put on there, and the large magazine release button. Maintains the nested recoil spring design. You'll see kind of what's called a carry cut to the front of the slide that kind of contours it for concealed carry purposes, easy reholstering, things like that. And then the marksman's barrel, which has a traditional lands and groove type barrel in it, which differs from the 4 previous generations that used a polygonal rifling. They called it the marksman's barrel and claimed that it was more accurate. Dubious claims in my opinion, but okay, Glock, we'll give you that one. So we saw that introduction. Then the other thing that I thought was fairly big, maybe some folks overlook, was the inclusion of a flared grip. So the grip flares out at the bottom. No longer can you pinch the magazine like this because it flares out. Now you really do have to rely on this thumb cut back here in the rear. We still do not see that horseshoe cut in the front. And so to get a stuck magazine out, you kind of have to do this to get it out, because you can no longer do this because your fingers are going to hit that flared magazine well. All right. And then the 19X, which is a variation of the Gen 5 handgun that was submitted to the military trials for the United States MHS program to replace the M9, which would be known as the M17, which SIG actually won with the P320 handgun. The reason it's here is it has kind of a mix of features on it. So where we see the flared magazine well in the Gen 5 civilian handgun, you'll notice there's no flared magazine well on the military submission handgun. It's smooth, so you can still strip the magazines the traditional American way. But you see the inclusion of a protective polymer tab that protects the front of the magazine from being banged. And then in the plug back here, you have a lanyard loop. So the military submission, you're not intended to strip the magazine like this. You're intended to strip it like we've been taught for so many generations. And you'll see that the forward slide serrations have been removed, but we have the ambi-slide controls. So that's where we are currently in terms of Generation 1 to Generation 5. And taking a look at the various generations, that surprisingly, they're surprisingly similar. The grip angles have remained the same, the triggers remain the same, very, very familiar controls. So over the years, you're gonna, if you bought a Gen 1 gun, if you buy a Gen 5 gun, you're gonna find it very easy to use. The magazines have gone through some evolutionary changes, but a Gen 1 magazine like this will fit into a Glock 19 of Gen 5 heritage. So where are we today with the Glock? Well, if you could take one thing away from this video this afternoon, is what we brought up in the last segment of the video. We talked about the various generational changes of the handgun, but if you look at it from kind of a bird's eye view, the handguns really haven't changed all that much. It's the same basic handgun. Glock hasn't innovated since 1982, which is why I call them the one-trick pony. They've made some basic cosmetic changes and some operational changes, obviously recoil springs and things like that. But in essence, it really is the same handgun that's being produced today that was introduced in 1982 or around that era. So today we find companies like Zev producing Gucci Glocks that are kind of changing the dynamic of the handgun. Still the same basic operating principles, same basic controls and internal safeties, things like that, but very few parts, if any, on this handgun are actually manufactured by Glock. You have the grip angle completely changed on this handgun, which is significant because a lot of people didn't like the original grip angle of this handgun. So people wanted a more vertical hand grip. So Zev gave them that. This one has a aluminum inserted part in front of the polymer frame here. So again, very few parts on this handgun are actually made by Glock. The frame's not made by Glock, the slide's not made by Glock, the barrel's not made by Glock. It has the RMR cut, but by the Gen 5, we get that with the factory Glock. But as you can see, the third-party market is evolving the handgun. They've even recontoured the trigger guard so you can get a deeper grip on the handgun, things like that. Things that Glock has resisted doing, making radical changes to the gun, especially with regards to the grip angle. Now, it's interesting to note that despite the fact that they've changed the grip angle of the gun significantly, it still uses the same factory Glock magazine as the Generation 1 magazines. So I can still lock them in there. And Magpul's jumped in the game. You know you've made it when Magpul makes a magazine for your product. So that brings us to the MHS handgun program, or the modular handgun system. And I think this is where Glock got trounced by the SIG entry. If you take a look at the Glock, there's nothing modular about it. The Glock has always used the same frame, and all they've allowed for you to do is change the back strap on it, which just makes a fat grip already fatter. I never cared for that. Some people love it. But when SIG came out with the P320, they put the serial number on an internal modular trigger system. So you can take the trigger out, which is the actual firearm, insert it into any number of different lowers that can even be made by the third-party market, which are thicker, wider, different grip angles and colors and things like that. So the modular system of this handgun really, I think, is one of the reasons the Army didn't choose the Glock 19X. Now, I'm just theorizing there, but the Glock is not modular in any sense of the word. The P320 is. Glock, since the very beginning, has put their serial numbers in the frame. So this polymer piece is the actual handgun. Again, with this handgun, it's the trigger system that you can't see within it that's the actual handgun, and it just has a window to the serial number underneath the slide stop slide release. And of course, it has a manual safety. So now let's talk about what that Generation 6 Glock could possibly look like. Now, before we go any further, guys, I'm going to put a link in the video description down below, the very first link at the very top of the description, that's going to take you to a poll. And we're going to propose some ideas to you guys on what we think Glock could do or should do for a Generation 6 handgun to make the gun more relevant in a very competitive market space. So please follow that link down below. It's to our Patreon page. It's a public post. And take that poll and tell us what features you think they might add to the Generation 6 gun or how they might change the handgun. So let's talk about what we think the direction for Glock may be in the future. First of all, I think the biggest thing that Glock's going to have to do is adopt the modular trigger system, where the trigger becomes the actual firearm and the polymer grip frame is replaceable and disposable. That's going to get us away from the rather goofy and not very effective, in my opinion, pin-on, tack-on pieces that just thicken the grip. They don't really improve the ergonomics. That would allow Glock to offer different modular frames, would allow the aftermarket community to easily offer them. Yes, there are already aftermarket frames out there, but you get the point. The frame is the handgun on the current generation of Glock. If you make the trigger the handgun, that changes the entire dynamic of the handgun and makes it more competitive with something like the M17 or the P320. Another thing that Glock really needs to take a look at is changing this trigger guard. It's very small. As I've already demonstrated, this is a thin glove, a mechanic's glove, and it already fills up that trigger guard. A full gloved finger is not going to fit in that tiny trigger guard. If you take a look at the M17 M18, you'll notice it has a much larger trigger guard, which allows you to get a gloved hand in there. That really needs to change for Glock. Glock could also improve the trigger of the gun. They've been like extremely bad triggers going all the way back to the first generation handgun. But if you take a look at a handgun like the Zev, they have really refined the trigger in the gun to the point where it's a world-class trigger. The factory Glock trigger really needs an update. So get the modular trigger system in there, get adjustable grip frames that people can modify, get the serial number off the lower, and that's going to make a really big difference. Now, also, you'll notice with the Zev, we've talked about the grip angle change. Obviously, Glock could do that without changing and losing backwards compatibility with the existing magazine out there. I think a lot of people will be worried about that. So they can maintain that backwards compatibility, but get that grip angle different for those folks that don't like it. Another thing that the P320 did was put a manual safety on the gun. Glock could include a manual safety. That would be huge to opening the doors to other customers out there that they're currently losing market share to because they don't include a safety. There's just people out there, I know it's a training issue and all that stuff, but there are people out there that avoid Glocks for no other reason than they don't have a manual safety. Make it optional. Smith & Wesson's been doing it for years. SIG's doing it now. Why wouldn't Glock? Give the consumers what they want. Don't force your will on them like you've been doing for 40 years. Give them what they want. Another thing I think is a weakness of the Generation 5 Glocks is the Mos Mounting System. It's not very durable. It's not very ruggedly built. When you put a red dot sight on there, the screws only bite a few threads. And the aftermarket community has sprung up to make that mounting system more robust, but as it currently stands, that mounting system definitely needs an update. So those are the changes that we think Glock could make. We'd also like to see Glock go to a true ambi design on the frame, so you'll have the ability to release the magazine without reversing the magazine release, be able to hit the button from either side and drop the magazine, maintain the existing ambi controls on the slide. So those are our changes. I really look forward to you guys taking the poll and reading the comments down below. What do you think the Generation 6 Glock is going to look like? What features would you like to see in the handgun that would make it either better in your opinion for somebody that's already a Glock user, or improve it to the point where it would bring in new users, because Glock is losing market share pretty quickly to competitive products. So that's what we think. Let's see what you guys think. Well, guys, we really appreciate you watching this video this afternoon. If you would like to support us here at the Military Arms channel so we can bring you content like this, please consider becoming part of our Patreon family. There's a link in the description below. Follow that link, read some of the perks, and consider supporting us on Patreon. You'll get access to early releases of videos. You'll have direct access to us for communications. I answer all private communications, and you'll be part of a community that has a great community going on. We have a community section in there, and you can interact with other Patreons. Also, right here on YouTube, you'll see a little join button underneath the video player. Consider clicking that join button and supporting us right here on YouTube. And last but not least, guys, please swing by and check us out at coppercustom.com. Thank you for 13 years of support. We'll talk to you guys soon.